Hello and welcome to Socialsuite's ESG GO webinar. We'll just wait a couple more minutes to allow everyone to join. In the meantime, it would be great to know where everyone is joining us from. If you could just put in the chat section on the right there. It would also be really interesting for us to know where you are on your ESG journey. Are you just starting out, or are you on your journey to becoming a bit of a pro? Thank you. That's great. Thank you, everybody. And for those that have just joined, if you could just pop in the chat where you're joining us from and where you are on your ESG journey, and I'll start in a few seconds. That's great. Thank you, everybody. I'll get started. Again, welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining Socialsuite's ESG GO webinar. I'd firstly like to introduce myself. My name is Jessica Schlosser. I've come on board recently to manage Socialsuite's business development. For nearly a decade, Socialsuite has been the global leader in impact and ESG measurement. We've aligned ESG GO with the standardized universal ESG framework that was developed by the World Economic Forum last year, which significantly reduces ambiguity in ESG disclosure. Over 50 companies have adopted Socialsuite's ESG GO in the last 6 months alone. It is fast becoming the go-to ESG reporting platform for small to medium companies globally. The ESG GO service is very easy to get started with minimal time impact to your management and team. Your quarterly ESG action plan, coupled with expert assistance, helps you make targeted progress, while the visual dashboard and templates helps you demonstrate your progress simply and clearly to stakeholders. ESG disclosure has never been this simple and affordable. Today, I'm joined by our leading ESG expert, Dr. Tim Siegenbeek van Heukelom. In our webinar series, In Conversations With, Tim will invite a subscriber to discuss their progress and insights on ESG reporting and the positive impact ESG GO has had on their business. Our special guest today is Neil Young, the Managing Director of Elixir Energy, an ASX-listed natural gas exploration and development company operating in Mongolia. Throughout the presentation, please don't hesitate to ask questions in the chat and we'll respond to them in the Q&A session at the end. I'll pass over to Tim now. Thank you.
Much appreciated for that warm welcome. And welcome as well, Neil. Thanks for joining us today. So before I jump into our conversation today with Neil and talk about how Elixir Energy is really going through that ESG journey, I really briefly will touch upon why is ESG important, why is it becoming so popular, and especially over the last year, 2 years. Look a little bit at is ESG specific to any particular industry or sector? How do you build ESG credentials? How is ESG GO a solution to really help you make simple, quick, and standardized ESG disclosures? And after that, that's only a few slides in a few minutes, we'll jump into that conversation with Neil and we'll talk about that ESG journey he's gone through. If you have any questions, pop them in the chat anyway throughout this webinar, and we'll make sure to have some time at the end to really go through those questions, either for Neil or for myself, to talk about that ESG disclosures, reporting, and journey. So first off, why is ESG important? It's really environment, social, and governance. It's really something that represents a more stakeholder-centric approach to doing business. So what we really see is that businesses are going towards a commitment to do more than just making a profit. So it's moving away from solely being focused on maximizing the financial benefits for your shareholders and really being actively contributing to the environment, reducing any impacts, being aware of what impacts you have, mitigating environmental risks, but also really strongly focused on the social side, social causes and things like gender equality, pay equality, human rights, and at large conducting your business operations in a responsible, ethical, and transparent way. So with ESG reporting, you're really creating that data set, the metrics, to enable the public at large or your stakeholders to see how are you doing in those three key areas there. And in particular, investors really find that interesting to look at assessing the impact you're having and how you operate your business. And what we've seen is that over the last few years, globally ESG assets are really on track now to exceeding 53 trillion by 2025. So what that means is that investors find now that ESG investments performing as well as, if not better than traditional investments. So it's really something they see that if you do ESG well, investors, the public at large are looking at you like they know how to mitigate risks. They know how to, look at opportunities from an environmental and social point of view, and really making sure that you're creating value which is shared. So it's financial value, but also social progress you're creating. And it's really popular in the last year, maybe 2 years. It's been around for a long time, but it's really now a move that you see ESG go from the fringe as a fringe consideration, or we need to think about the environment, to a core element around corporate strategy, about corporate purpose, about who you are as a business. So we see companies and investors really seeing that financial capital they're trying to create go hand in hand with human and natural benefits they can create. Now, the global pandemic has really spiked interest in more ethical companies. There's always been social activisms, but that really is now rewarding that sustainability within businesses. And you see corporate activism also really being on the rise with, I think ExxonMobil was a really good example a few months ago, where 3 board directors were replaced by environmental activists because the company's direction was not what some of the main investors liked. So they said, we will drive that through corporate activism. The key thing there to realize is that ESG is not really just focused on those type of companies. ExxonMobil, Shell, they're all big resource companies. ESG is industry agnostic. It is across the board. But you need to realize that, of course, each industry has its own unique set of issues, risks, and opportunities around sustainability and ESG. And again, fossil fuels are more focused on that environmental side, climate change, carbon emissions, greenhouse gas. Look at healthcare, you're looking more at the social side. Look at the financial sector, you're more on social and governments there. But what it really means is that there's no industry that is not affected by ESG. So if we don't realize that ESG is important, how do you build as a business ESG credentials? And we see that really as like 3 main building blocks to demonstrating strong ESG credentials. First element being reporting, disclosing where you are, showing the world what is your ESG starting point, how are you making disclosures and showing the world where you stand today, and reporting continuously on what you're doing in that ESG space. And in doing that, you start to realize it's like a trigger, a catalyst for, well, I'm disclosing this information. Now, how well are we actually doing? So it helps you to do a gap analysis on how well your ESG is doing, the excellence of your ESG indicators and disclosures, and enables you to look at where can you improve. And throughout that whole journey, it's really important that you create a narrative and share that journey with the world. So really capture what you're doing and show the world what those steps are you are taking. So all that together, those elements, really helps you build strong ESG credentials. Now, around that, a lot of companies find it's really hard to find that starting point. So where do you start? Do you first set up strategy at large? Do you shape that narrative, but about what? For most companies, and especially small to middle-sized companies, the simplest point to start is just by start making disclosures. Find a framework that enables you to really tell the world on these indicators, show you where we are today. And that's what we've done with ESG GO. We've adopted the World Economic Forum's universal ESG framework 21 indicators that give you a simple and quick starting point to show the world what you're doing in terms of ESG. So with ESG GO, we create a dashboard that then enables you to track across 4 areas: governance, planet, people, and prosperity, how you are progressing and making disclosures and really demonstrating quarter over quarter how you're going through that ESG journey, what you're doing. And I think this is a really good point to bring Neil into the conversation, because Neil has been using this. He set a baseline earlier this year with us, and he's been going through that ESG journey for a while now. So it'll be really interesting, Neil. Thanks for joining us today to hear a little bit more about your ESG journey. But I think first off, can you tell us a little bit more about who is Elixir Energy? What type of business are you in? Give us your elevator pitch.
Thanks, Tim, for the invite, and hopefully this discussion will be of interest to the audience. So to recap, my name's Neil Young. I'm the Managing Director of Elixir Energy Limited. We are listed on the ASX, and we are solely focused at present on a single asset, which is a license to explore for gas in the form of coal seam gas, as it's known in Australia, in the country of Mongolia, which is located just to the north of China. China is the world's largest energy importer, a very dirty consumer of coal, dominates its energy consumption. And so my initial view was 10 years ago was that if Australia can supply gas commercially to China, then the better located Mongolia would be a good spot to seek to do the same. And here we are. We're currently drilling in the country. We've made an initial discovery. We're appraising that. And as the picture illustrates, we have a very large license in a very large country, albeit one that's very sparsely populated. We operate in the famous Gobi Desert, and I'll talk about some of the impacts that has on our ESG journey in the course of this discussion.
Excellent, thanks, Neil. Now, that's really useful to get a sense of the type of industry that Elixir is in, where you operate, and like you said, that will really feed into the discussion we'll have. Now, I think from our perspective, really interesting. You really joined that you started an ESG journey, at least with Socialsuite earlier this year. But it would be quite interesting to hear from you, I guess, at large. Can you share with us a little bit about the thinking that you had around Elixir's ESG journey leading up to joining ESG GO? What is that journey you've gone through, with the business, but also perhaps personal?
I suppose as an energy company, we probably touch upon at least the E in ESG more closely than most businesses. We are in the gas business, and we believe that supplying natural gas and displacing coal is a public good. But we're also acutely aware that the energy transition, which is expected over coming decades, will see a reduction in the demand for fossil fuels, including gas eventually. My background, in addition to oil and gas, has included power and renewables over a considerable period. And I was particularly, therefore, initially attracted to ESG through the prism of the energy transition, but also wanted to look at and adopt the other features. And a key catalyst there was around about this time last year, one of our directors resigned, and hence there was a board vacancy. We were a typical resources company dominated by old white blokes like me. And I felt it was critically important to bring variety to the board, in particular bring female representation. And we did that in October last year. And I think that was a key aspect of our ESG planning pre the adoption of the Socialsuite methodology, but something that really catalyzed that thinking and put us on the journey to engage with Socialsuite and then get on with the reporting there afterwards.
Excellent. So that's really interesting to hear that was that key trigger point for you to think about, from a governance point of view, where do we stand, our board makeup, what can we do to, be more ESG inclusive in terms of our governance. Now, thinking about that ESG journey from that point you just described there, what were the considerations you then had to, I guess, to move forward? Like, how did you figure out what would be the logical next steps to do more in that ESG space? I guess really trying to get at what were the hurdles or roadblocks or the reasons for you to get started with ESG, and how did you find a way to move forward from there? You appointed a board director. How do you then figure out what the logical next steps are?
Well, Tim, I think that's where really Socialsuite came in. I mean, I, like many, would have been reading about ESG, seeing its increasing importance in the eyes of investors through the course of 2020. But to be honest, I'm the only employee of this company in Australia. We've got a number in Mongolia, and I didn't have the time or background to go and do the research necessary to come up with a best practice ESG identification and reporting process. So obviously I was introduced to you through a company that we use for other purposes, and that accordingly provided a solution to my queries as to what's the framework for actually doing this in a best practice way that means that I don't have to reinvent the wheel and maybe get the wheel square rather than circular. So that was really the key there, to find a methodology and system that made my life easy, and I didn't need to spend too much time on those, but it could instead spend time on the things which contributed towards improved ESG.
Thanks. Yeah, that is really interesting. Yeah, that from that perspective. Now that you've started using and making disclosures against an ESG framework, then how has that changed? Has that resulted in any, I guess, tangible changes to your business, your strategy, your operations, your governance? Like you pointed out that catalyst, that point where you appointed a new board director, but by going through this process now for, since the start of this year, having a really standardized set of disclosures to look at and make, has that impacted the day-to-day operations and strategy and thinking about where Elixir as a business is?
I think a good example of something tangible that the process led us to consider and then implement was trying to work out what our scope 1 and scope 2 carbon emissions were, which in the end of the day turned out to be, in a material sense, fairly simple. It's the diesel that is consumed by our drilling company in our drilling operations. And once you ask the drilling company what they consume, they know, because it's clearly a cost to them. And it's data that therefore you can obtain in our instance, fairly simply. And then converting diesel use into carbon emissions, a bit of web investigation soon provides a formula through which to do that. And then you end up with tons of CO2 equivalent emitted in a reporting period. And we're using sort of calendar years because that's the modus operandi in the country in which we operate. I mean, we could do it as fiscal years, it doesn't really matter. And so we've gone through a process of identifying that, we've calculated it, we now report it, and then that leads to, well, what are we going to do about it? And in our industry, one of the things, particularly at the early stage, to do is consider purchasing carbon offsets. But we decided, well, instead of buying those in Australia or through some international forum, it made the most sense in terms of our local stakeholder engagement to seek a local solution. And so this is one of the, I suppose, ancillary but meaningful benefits of working with Tim, was that he had a person he recommended to us who had global experience in working in developing nations on carbon offset businesses involving forestry, and passed that contact on, and that led us to engagement with that person who is helping us looking at options for plant and forestry based carbon offsets in Mongolia and in the Gobi Desert specifically. Excellent.
Now that's a really interesting journey to see that like you said, from that point of where you make a disclosure, where does that lead you? And that's that from reporting to excellence, you report something and that triggers a thought around, well, what can we do about it? What's the next step there? So around that, I guess a little bit around that journey there, have you had any feedback at this point in time already from investors or shareholders or other stakeholders at large about your ESG journey so far, any disclosures you've made, the Forrester you were talking about? Have you heard anything yet that it's been taken on board by them, and any positive feedback?
Well, I suppose, Tim, a lot of the response that you'll get is the stuff that you never actually hear, and that is, if someone doesn't invest in you, you never know about it, or if someone does because you've passed a key hurdle, then they're not necessarily going to tell you about it. But if you don't do anything, then you'll never know. I think one of the interesting aspects that we've seen as a ASX listed company is a journey whereby our investor base has gone from the traditional stockbrokers and in effect retired blokes on hot copper to include a much broader generational mix of people who get information on different social media sources such as Reddit or whatever. And we think that those additional groups have been far more likely to consider ESG suitability to be a criteria for investment. As and when we did a placement earlier this year, and some of that money went towards institutional investors, they made it clear that ESG was a required part of their investment assessment mix, and really passing certain hurdles and demonstrating that one was considering it, measuring it, and doing something about it rather than being perfect up front was important to them. So I think that's certainly been significant, and in the longer term, we, like all small companies, want to grow, and we recognize that as we do, the nature of our shareholder base will likely change to become more institutionally orientated, and we want to be ready for that rather than scramble as and when we get to that point.
I think that's a really key point there, that proactive approach, and I think that's a core message that we get from investors at large. At this point in time, right now, 2021, what they want to see from most companies is a commitment to ESG and commitment to disclose. Not about being perfect. It's just a proactive commitment. We will voluntarily start disclosing our ESG indicators and how we operate our business. Probably in about five years' time, it's much more focused on getting closer to being perfect, that excellence part. It's now about seeing people starting to make disclosures. So I think, and talking about disclosure, I think that might be a good time to quickly bring up your baseline that we set earlier this year. So this is what we're looking at now in Socialsuite. This is a ESG GO report of the baseline that we set with Neil. This is really the front end. We're only looking at the governance pillar now. Under there are the other 3 pillars, so it makes up 21 indicators. And what you really see is what we do at that very starting point is we talk about each of these 21 indicators, and we'll look at where are you in the process of developing information, collating information to make a disclosure. So you see the yellow box here, development. That really means a company is getting the information together, packaging it up in a way that's approachable for stakeholders at large, and then putting it somewhere in the public domain. So this is the starting point. We'll go to the next slide here. This is more of a comparison report where you see that baseline, and then in what we call period, you go to reporting periods. Every calendar quarter is a period. And you see there's been some progress here. Some of the reported indicators have been verified. So my question would be, Neil, for you from like your kind of user point of view, how you found that process of having a platform like ESG GO with 21 indicators? How have you used that in the last few months or the last 2 quarters, and how did that work for you?
Well, certainly having a framework that's globally recognized and easily understandable once you get into it is great, and it provides a framework under which for each category you go, well, what are we doing now, and if we're happy with it, how do we justify that if it's not world's best practice? Or if we're not happy with it, what are we going to tangibly do to improve it in a defined reporting period, and then using yourself as a regular check and sounding board, in effect forces action, because otherwise it's easy to go, oh, I'll do something about it later this year, and then you're suddenly into next year. If I said I'm going to do something in a quarter, then and I haven't, then I feel personally internally admonished, and so accordingly a framework actually forces action rather than just kicking a can down a road.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and that's what we've really structured around quarterly progress. So a month is probably just not enough time to get anything meaningful done. But within a quarter, there are definitely some things to take some action on. But it's also that key check-in, just making sure that people actually it's front of mind. And I think the core thing around ESG is that it's not a one-off design sprint you're doing for a week or two, and then you park it somewhere on a shelf and you say, we've done our ESG, it's done now. ESG should really come to the core of how you operate a business, how you govern a business. So by having quarterly actions and steps and disclosures, it becomes over time this ongoing mindset. Yeah, right, we're doing things in environment and social and governance, and at every step of the way, decision making, it plays a role in that. Now, one of the key questions we get from a lot of other people in this space is, so if you make a disclosure, where do you put it then? Like, yes, our annual report, we do that once a year. That might be a nice place, but we want to show people now that we're making those disclosures. And you found a really good solution there. And I've noted quite a few other companies that are subscribing to ESG GO have copied that approach. So I think you could say best practice from Elixir Energy. Can you tell us a bit more what how you address that?
I think generally people have a legal framework of ASX reporting and ASIC requirements and audit requirements in quarterly reports or annual reports. And if they haven't got that, then obviously one needs to devise one's own method of reporting. And we find a website is a tool that's easy for us to use. It's easy for readers to navigate their way to and read. And it can be kept updated as often as one likes, whereas an annual report's only once a year, a quarterly report only once a quarter. And in a website, you're not constrained as to what you can say. And accordingly, we found it a pretty useful tool without having screeds of information that rather summarizing the key points under the relevant headings that you see there. Illustrating things with pictures, which makes it more appealing and understandable, and gives context of, for instance, in our case, as to where we're working and what it looks like. So it's been a really useful addition to our website. And we have done annual reporting. We just did that in the last week or so, or we've referenced things in our quarterly, but those are out of date as soon as you've published them. And this is more of a live thing that we look to update on say a quarterly basis.
It's a great tool, and like I said, it's really considered best practice in that ESG space. It's like a really low threshold way of sharing disclosures. Like you said, it's a win-win for everyone. All stakeholders have easy access to see what you're doing, and it really drives that I guess a transparency approach, and that is really core to ESG. It is all about being transparent about what you do. So if you say, well, we're disclosing, but it's somewhere in our corporate governance statement, hidden on our website, 3 menu structures down somewhere, yes, it's there. The disclosure is made. But putting it front and center and being open about it, so just summarize it here, will make it easy for you to find that information. That's a core thing. Now, I realize we're closing into the end of this webinar, so I do want to leave a little bit of time for any questions to come up. So my final question really would be for you, Neil. Do you have any final top tips for other companies who are looking to either starting their ESG journey or just started? Anything that comes to mind that you found is really a good tip for them to take into consideration?
Yeah, I think if one considers ESG as an unfortunate series of boxes that need to be ticked, then one's engagement with it is going to fail. It needs to actually drive change and actions, some of which might be challenging, like changing the nature of a board composition is not necessarily easy. There are substantial social issues often involved. Or, for instance, looking at carbon offsets, well, they're going to cost money. We're probably going to spend 30 grand shortly, even at an early stage, on doing so, and that's money out of the door. So we think that both of those things are worthwhile and make for a better company and a better investment. But it's not something that was just keeping Tim happy and ticking boxes. It's real, and sometimes it's difficult, but we find it's important and rewarding.
Wonderful. That's great. I think that is the key there. You've really taken ESG to heart, and really putting it at the core of what Elixir is doing. I think that's the key thing that a lot of companies are trying to understand. Where does ESG live? Is it this fringe consideration, or where do we place it? And I think, like you said, yes, you need to do some work there. It is about disclosing, improving, thinking about, hard and critically about how you do things and doing that consistently. So I think that's a really good point. So with that, I really want to thank you, Neil, for sharing your ESG journey with us. It's very encouraging and insightful to see how you're, managing Elixir through that energy transition at large and taking this on board. So thanks for sharing your insights with us today.
Well, thanks for the invitation, Tim, and we'll see you soon.
Wonderful. So for everyone, like ESG GO is really a tool that helps you get started on that journey. It makes reporting easy. It's a simple framework, 21 indicators. If you were to start your journey today, like what we did with Neil, is we'll take an hour, run you through that baseline, create that starting point of where you are today, and then we'll provide you with all the guidance, templates, expert advice, support that you need to really start making quarterly progress. And then at the end of the quarter, you'll have a dashboard like you saw in a previous slide, which you can share with the market at large. You can use it internally to check where you are. You really have something every quarter to see, yes, we are still committed to ESG, and this is our progress. So with that, before I hand back to Jessica, she will probably have some questions that come in the chat during our conversation here. If you want to sign up with ESG GO, contact Jessica after this webinar, and she can take that further. So Jess, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Neil. That was fantastic. Just opening up to any questions that anyone might have. Just put in the chat box. None just yet. That's fine. If any questions come to you, please don't hesitate to reach out. Also, if you would like a deep dive demonstration, absolutely, we can arrange that specific to your business as well. This session is recorded. If you would like the slides, I can send those to you also. Otherwise, you will receive a link to be able to share this with others and watch it later. Great. I think I'll finish there. Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, everyone. And thank you, Neil, for joining us and helping others on their ESG journey as well.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.